Welcome back. Today we will get back to our roots, so to speak, and back into the Old World series of videos. Our focus being the oldest and most important cities from the Old World, or pre-1900. In these videos, we take a look at the oldest photographs of these cities, while discussing briefly the history the current narrative gives for each one. Today we will focus on the Old World city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Being from Pennsylvania myself, I've always been fascinated by the city of Pittsburgh. Growing up, it always felt as though Pittsburgh was overshadowed by the accomplishments and the history of Philadelphia, and I was never taught about the vast and meaningful history of Pittsburgh properly. That accelerated my curiosity in this case. I've had the luxury of visiting Pittsburgh once in my life, and to say the photographs do not do it justice is an understatement. Today, we will briefly look through roughly 200 unique images of Pittsburgh, while briefly discussing the history the current narrative applies to this city. For me, I like to begin these videos with the roots of the city, and in the case of Pittsburgh, these roots run very deep. According to modern-day historians, a site excavated beginning in 1973 called the Meadowcroft Rockshelter, which resides along the coast of Cross Creek off the Ohio River and just outside of Pittsburgh, is home to the earliest known humans to have ever walked foot in the quote-unquote New World. These pre-Clovis, pre-Paleo Indians are said to have continually inhabited this area for more than 19,000 years, making the Meadowcroft Rockshelter the site of the earliest human presence and the longest sequence of continuous human occupation in North America. The Meadowcroft Rockshelter was discovered by Albert Miller in 1955, although in hopes the site wouldn't be hidden by the authorities or decimated by vandals, he did not share his findings until 1973. This discovery led to the coining of the scientific term, the Miller Complex, which refers to the large inhabitation of pre-Clovis natives who lived in basin-shaped hearths, utilized flint and jasper, hunted marine crustaceans, constructed small blades and arrowheads with fluted points, as well as built pottery and even homes with intricate polyhedral designs. These polyhedral blades and arrowheads would be adopted later by the Clovis natives, which is one determining factor that points to the Meadowcroft Rockshelter predating any known natives to have ever walked North America. The Meadowcroft site is also home to one of the most well-preserved documentations of ancient animal life, as over 149 unique species were found fossilized or petrified within the site. According to the current narrative, the Adena native culture followed. The Adena natives were mound builders and known to have constructed the largest burial mound in Pennsylvania near the mouth of the Ohio River outside of Pittsburgh in what is now known as McGee's Rock. Following decades, possibly centuries, of Adena culture flourishing in this area, at some point it's written the Hopewell culture integrated into the Pittsburgh area. These natives of the Hopewell culture would eventually come to rule over the land of Pittsburgh and add to the growth of the area, including expanding on the ancient mounds that I previously mentioned. By 1709, the narrative says, the Iroquois nation had become the main culture to occupy the land of Pittsburgh. In a survey conducted by Conrad Weiser in 1748, he counted that 789 Native Americans gathered at Pittsburgh. This included 163 Seneca, 74 Mohawk, 35 Onondaga, 20 Cayuga, and 15 Oneida. Queen Alaquipa of the Seneca tribe was also known to reside very close to Pittsburgh in the Seneca village of Shanopenstown. In 1748, the Ohio Company first surveyed the land of Pittsburgh. From Cumberland, Maryland, the first road to Pittsburgh was begun, although it mostly followed the same path as an ancient Indian trail. The job of constructing this road was undertaken by a Native American leader by the name of Nemacolin, and thus the trail is now known as Nemacolin's Trail. In 1749, the French sent men to begin to lay claim to the land that is now Pittsburgh. From that year forward, through 1753, the governor of New France, Marquis Duquesne, sent a large expedition party of roughly 1,500 men to construct forts throughout the area of Pittsburgh. In retaliation, the governor of Virginia, Dinwiddie, sent General George Washington to Pittsburgh to kindly ask the French to leave. When the French declined, this is when Dinwiddie sent Captain William Trent to build a fort on what is now present-day Pittsburgh City. The fort, then known as Fort Prince George, was only half completed in 1754 when over 500 French soldiers arrived, expelled the British, tore down the semi-completed Fort Prince George, and constructed Fort Duquesne. According to the narrative, the next 10 years would see reoccurring bloody battles between the natives, the British, and the French that culminated in the French and Indian, or 7 Years' War. During this time, the Braddock expedition, led by George Washington, built the first road over the Appalachian Mountains, but ended up facing a massive defeat in the Battle of Monongahela. In 1758, a heavily manned campaign was launched by the British. Over 7,000 armed troops retook Fort Duquesne. According to the narrative, the British burned the French fort to the ground and constructed their own stone fort on top. This would later become known as Fort Pitt. At this same time, the British would officially name the land between the Ohio and the Monongahela rivers as Pittsboro, named after William Pitt the Elder of England. Pittsboro would later become known as Pittsburgh. In the following years, in 1763, Pontiac's War broke out as Ottawa Native Americans attacked Fort Pitt, led by Pontiac. After this rebellion, the Fort Stanwix Treaty of 1768 was signed by the Iroquois, ceding the lands of Pittsburgh to the British. Although the British occupied this land, Pittsburgh and Fort Pitt, for many years, the control of this area transitioned to the United States in 1777, becoming one of the most important forts for the United States. After the Revolution, the city of Pittsburgh began to flourish, and the crafting of water vessels, as well as a boom in the importance of education, occurred. By 1787, a charter was signed for the Pittsburgh Academy, which would go on later to become known as the University of Western Pennsylvania in 1819, or in modern times, simply known better as Pitt, one of the oldest and most important education systems in all of the United States. Pittsburgh's location made it one of the most important trade centers in all of the country. By 1800, with a population of roughly 1,500 people, Pittsburgh already had 60 unique stores, including bakeries, butchers, and hat and shoe shops. In the 1810s, Pittsburgh began to grow very rapidly. In 1811, the first steamboat was constructed in Pittsburgh, and with the outbreak of the War of 1812, Pittsburgh became the country's center for iron production. Britain had a tactic of cutting off iron trade with America, which seemed very intelligent at first. However, British forces did not predict just how rapidly Pittsburgh would be able to produce iron. By 1815, Pittsburgh was producing $764,000 worth of iron, $249,000 worth of brass and tin, and $235,000 worth of glass products for the United States every year. In 1818, the first bridge connecting Pittsburgh to the mainland was completed, and in 1834, the Pennsylvania Canal opened, only furthering Pittsburgh's control of trade and rapid expansion in the area. In 1840, the first road connecting Pittsburgh and Philadelphia was completed. Now, this is about the time that we get to our first major disaster in the history of Pittsburgh. While the population numbers tell us that Pittsburgh was hovering right around the top 10, you can see from many of the old world paintings and depictions of Pittsburgh that it was a vast and ever-expanding city. Spurred by economic growth and war necessity, Pittsburgh was full of massive old world buildings and factories. However, a great fire in the year of 1845 nearly wiped out the entire city of Pittsburgh. According to the current narrative, the fire broke out when a woman was heating water over coals for doing her laundry. For only a moment, she left the fire unattended. However, in this short time, a spark jumped out of the fireplace and ignited the surrounding building. This fire would eventually come to blanket the entire city of Pittsburgh. And I will leave some written accounts of the fire within the video, so feel free to pause and read those if you would like. However, in a nutshell, 1/3 of the entire old world city of Pittsburgh was destroyed. This fire caused in 1845 $6 to $12 million in damages. While no photographs exist of the damage, we do have artistic depictions of the aftermath of the fire. According to first-hand sources, the fire was unlike anything ever seen before, and many of the people of Pittsburgh thought it to be biblical. This fire burned through stone buildings and melted solid metal and zinc roof. We have paintings of Pittsburgh after the Great Fire, which I'll include here, and it certainly resembles many of the other old world cities which have faced a similar fate. We can see how the stone and masonry buildings are basically lying, seemingly cut in half by these flames. It's truly remarkable. However, unlike many of the other old world cities, Pittsburgh was not ruined by this fire, but much to the contrary, the fire actually fueled Pittsburgh to rapidly rebuild, as all aspects of the city seemed to experience even faster growth than before. And the development and implication of steel around this time helped the city of Pittsburgh reach a peak it had really never seen before. So this fire, which really tore down all of the old world buildings and all of the quote-unquote iron construction, led the way for the steel city to emerge. So walking hand in hand with these sort of steel and iron constructions was the advancement of the railroad to the area. In 1851, the Ohio Railroad came to Pittsburgh, and in 1854, the Pennsylvania Railroad began to operate out of Pittsburgh. Now, the onset of the Civil War boosted Pittsburgh's production even more. The Fort Pitt Foundry began producing munitions at a rapid pace and even constructed what were at the time the largest weapons ever built for use on the battlefield. By the war's end, steel production was at an all-time high and grew even faster with the 1875 implication of the Bessemer process at the Edgar Thomas Works in Braddock, Pittsburgh. We're going to have a focus on the iron and steel constructions and inventions, and we'll notice all of these new bridges and new roadways, new pathways that are being built, and they're very advanced, they're very smooth, and they're very interesting. And we're also going to look at some of the more advanced equipment that is being put in use, including the funiculars, which are really all around the city of Pittsburgh. And at one point or another, Pittsburgh was known for all the different funiculars that it had. And we're just going to take a look at some of these old world photographs of these devices in use. And if you see anything in here that stands out to you or you want to comment on, let me know down below, and we'll hop back into the narrative in just a little bit. Throughout the late 1800s, industrialists flocked to Pittsburgh, and the new industrial Pittsburgh was based on integrated mills, mass production, and the implementation of steel into other facets of the working world. With this expanse of wealth came a great deal of refinement. And this would create an interesting dichotomy between the working class and the upper class of Pittsburgh. On one side of the city, you would have these large factories and the smokestacks, and the workers that were working very long hours and leaving the job covered in soot. And on the other side of the town, you would have Millionaires Row with these mansions and these people like Carnegie who were always looking to expand the town and to gather more information about the history. While I'm not going to include them all because I've mentioned them in a previous video about the railway, I am going to include a couple of these tunnels that were built, according to the narrative, in the 1800s in Pittsburgh, and these were said to have been built to be used for the different railroad systems. So I just found it to be really interesting. These aren't going to be the tunnels that were built through the mountains, although those are interesting, and I would recommend checking out my video on the Pennsylvania Railroad. But these are tunnels in the immediate Pittsburgh area, and they're all very, very old world in nature. So while Pittsburgh was this ever-expanding and always beautiful land, it's really interesting that it never seemed to last, or at least any rendition of it never seemed to last for more than 50 to 75 years, and we always have these major disasters that seem to come into play. And in this case, in 1936, Pittsburgh experienced a great flood where a majority of the city was flooded in up to 46 feet of water. And this really destroyed many of the remaining buildings, many of the, whether you want to call them old world or new old world, steel and iron buildings from the late 1800s. Many of these were destroyed or severely damaged. And it says that there were over 3 billion in damages. So just really interesting. And because this happened in 1936, we do find a couple more photographs, and they're all remarkable. And check out this building right here. This is the Old Conservatory of Pittsburgh. They're saying that this housed all the equipment to look into the stars. And I just found it to be really interesting. It reminded me a little bit of the old Crystal Palaces and the different buildings that we see in many other old world cities. And if you look at some of the older photographs of this building, you can see at one point this building was very, very large, and it housed a lot of antiquitech, including this old school telescope and things of that nature. And this is actually one of the buildings that they say is preserved or still exists in Pittsburgh today. So I just thought that was really interesting, and I would include that in this video for you. Now, the lavish lifestyle, one of the riches and the refinement, was shared by many of the soon-to-be millionaires who resided and came from Pittsburgh, including Henry Clay Frick, Andrew Mellon, Charles Schwab, and most importantly, in my opinion, Andrew Carnegie. As I've discussed in previous videos about the Pennsylvania Railroad and about the different tunnels that were built in the 1800s, Andrew Carnegie was a very sly businessman, and that is the term I'm going to use. And my audience out there, I would definitely recommend looking into Carnegie and his history of collecting artifacts and all these different museums that he built in Pittsburgh. They are beautiful. They have really grand architecture that lends to the old world, and you just wonder about all the different artifacts that are hidden within these museums that we really haven't been able to see even to this day. And Carnegie really has his hand in many of the building constructions all around Old World Pittsburgh. All different buildings were built under his auspices or under his money, basically. So I really recommend looking into all the things that he discovered and how he achieved all the different things that he achieved. And here's a look at the old stadium in Pittsburgh. And I include this because I like to include the stadiums of all these old world cities when I make these videos, if I can find them. We see in many of the oldest photographs of these stadiums, they first appeared as earth mounds or things of that nature. So I just found it very interesting. And you can see many of these photographs. Pittsburgh is such a vast and beautiful city. By the 1900s and throughout the early 1920s, Pittsburgh was a key industrial powerhouse and one of the most integral cities in America. I will include some numbers within the video, but in a nutshell, Pittsburgh was producing ridiculous fractions of America's gross national product. Many corporations and companies are stationed in Pittsburgh, even to this day. One of those companies is Westinghouse, whom, amongst other accomplishments, is credited as establishing the first known particle collider, or particle accelerator, which in return led to advancements in nuclear physics. I will include the few known photographs of the particle accelerator in this video. One thing I find really fascinating about Pittsburgh is it was once a land of many domes, and because of its location, they say there were many observatories that were built in Pittsburgh, and many other churches were constructed in a very similar fashion. It's very reminiscent of the old world, and it's just really interesting to talk about how they created the buildings with these domes and these awesome observatories and things of that nature. We have a lot of unique buildings that once stood in Pittsburgh. A lot of these photographs, they speak for themselves, but here's what I wanted to point out to you. This is the natatorium, and this is basically just another word for a bathhouse. And these were known as Turkish baths, and these occupied a pretty large portion of a street in Pittsburgh. What's interesting is if you read into this a little bit, there's actually naturally occurring saltwater wells that flow all throughout Pittsburgh, and that was used to source the water for this natatorium or this Turkish bathhouse. And you can see it's got a really old world design. It's basically 2 stories, and it's really intricate and really interesting. You know, we look into these old bathhouses and we question the narrative about when or how they were created and how they were discovered, these naturally flowing saltwater baths. So just something interesting I wanted to point out to you and include a couple photographs of. Here is what could be considered a more modern building. This is the Cathedral of Learning, a 42-story skyscraper at the University of Pittsburgh. We talked about Pitt earlier, but this building stands 535 feet tall, and it's basically the tallest educational building in the Western Hemisphere. And this thing is massive. It's beautiful, and it does scream to me a little about the old world. Now, the design is interesting because it's built with the sort of masonry of the old world and not with the steel that Pittsburgh is known for. So just something that I thought I would point out. Another awesome building, and not many old world photographs of it, although they do say it was built in the 1900s. I think one of the most beautiful and overlooked aspects of Old World Pittsburgh is all the different engines that were being used all around this land, all the different things that were being powered and invented and created and sustained. they were using many different inventions that were all relatively new at the time that they were being employed. So I just found that to be really interesting. I find Pittsburgh to be very fascinating and one of the most advanced areas of the 1800s America. And I do think there's a lot more to the history than even I have scratched into, and I hope to discover more very soon. While Pittsburgh is often overshadowed by its brotherly city of Philadelphia, I believe it is Pittsburgh who put the physicality into the term the Keystone State. Pittsburgh supplied the iron, which built our bridges, the steel that built our nation's railroads. Pittsburgh built our steamships and allowed them safe passage. Pittsburgh did not look down when evil stared back, but instead employed and empowered its citizens to do more, to strive in times of war, and to thrive in times of war. Pittsburgh is a well-known mystery, a cultural mixing ground, the land that built our country, and a place that I do have great respect for. So in conclusion, I thank you for taking the time to watch this video and be here. The channel's really growing fast. I'm seeing a lot of really positive and informative comments on all of my videos, and I just want to say thank you very much for that. If you live in Pittsburgh or have anything you'd like to add to this video, please let me know in the comments down below. I love to hear what you have to say. And what was your favorite image in this video? Which one appears the most out of the old world or unexplainable to you? And which one of these images do you think is the most interesting? I'd love to hear anything you have to say, and we will talk again very soon.